Present.
Mr. Miglio,
Here.
Ms. Shockley,
Here.
Mr. Mushak,
Here.
Ms. Peniston,
Here.
and Ms. Langalis, who we can't see but is by phone. Tammy, are you here or are you muted?
I'm here.
Okay. And so we do have two members who won't be joining us tonight, but everybody else is in attendance.
So Steve's not joining, and I know about John Lesko.
Yes, Steve had a crisis come up at home, so he couldn't make it either.
Okay. Move forward, Steve.
Okay, so tonight is one of two public hearings related to an amendment to the citywide plan, the Plan of Conservation and Development, to incorporate the East Norwalk Neighborhood TOD plan into the POCD. So what we're planning on doing is myself and Emily Ennis from Harriman Group will do a hopefully not too long of a presentation. Some of you have seen this before. Some of you, I imagine, multiple times from the audience perspective. We'll run you through the basics of the plan. Emily will go into more detail about the zoning and the design guidelines. We'll take any questions that the commission members have, and then we'll open it up for public comment. Emily and myself will respond to questions as they arise. As I mentioned, this is the first of two hearings. The next hearing is Monday night, the 24th at 6:30. We'll post that agenda tomorrow with all the meeting information in terms of Zoom and YouTube and all that. So that'll be up tomorrow. I think it's up now, but I'm not sure if the meeting info is attached to it, but we'll get that up there as well. And at the end, maybe if there's time, the commission, we could talk about, separate from the TOD plan and the POCD, is other agenda items for your next meeting and some other things going forward, if there's time to talk about schedule. So whenever you're ready, we can start.
Okay, as far as the public hearing goes, I'll make some comments right before we go into it. Okay, so go ahead.
Sure. Okay, can everybody see my screen now?
Yes, Steve.
Yep.
Okay, should be PowerPoint. Okay. And again, some of this you've seen before, but I'm just gonna, it's good since it's a public hearing to go through this in case there are anybody who hasn't seen it yet, anybody has forgotten something, so we'll go through items and answer questions as they come up. This is the study area. It's a half-mile radius around the train stations. That's how the state defines TOD. So when we first started looking at this, we excluded the area, that hatched area, which is at the north or the top of the image. And that's when you get north of 95, which is kind of its own area. So we excluded that from the study area. I'll come back to this slide later on in the presentation, but just keep in mind that this whole circle, and this is not an exact number, but it's about a little under 500 acres. So we're going to show you recommendations on a much smaller scale in terms of what the overall plan is about. So this plan came about, something as I started getting familiar with the city about almost 4 years ago now, thinking about areas that, where it seems like there hadn't been planning or outreach done. There was a plan done for South Norwalk at that time. Work was being done on Wall Street and West Avenue. Merit 7 had been undergoing planning more so by the applicant than anything else, but there was planning in that area, whereas East Norwalk really seemed like it hadn't had the same amount of attention that was needed, and there were some, and there are some fantastic areas of East Norwalk, some really well-established neighborhoods, but there are some areas that need a little TLC, and particularly the East Avenue stretch from 95 down to the train station, which is really the main thrust and main focus of the plan that we've put together. And Emily's going to take over for a little bit and talk to you about the vision and the goals that came out of our work. And then I'm going to get into like the broader big pictures of the plan, and Emily will come back and talk about the zoning and the design guidelines.
Good evening. My name is Emily Ennis. I'm Director of Planning for Harriman. Harriman is a lead consultant in helping the city with this plan, and it's a pleasure to be talking with you all tonight. So I'm going to kick off with the vision and the goals for the plan. I won't read every word of every slide, but I do want to call out in the first, this first slide here is the real focus on the high quality of life for all in the area. So that is, of course, existing residents and businesses and new ones that may come in. The idea of the quality of life really came out of the public meetings that we had, the public forums, what we heard back, and heard a lot about pedestrian comfort, pedestrian safety, walkability, the idea of amenities that would then support that. And that would include both amenities from future private development, but also in terms of the city's own infrastructure. And finally, really trying to create a planning process both now and as a model in the future for including community voices and focusing on enhancing this neighborhood as a real maritime community, harkening back to its history and how many people view it. So you see these 6 components of that vision and goal. And Steve, if you'll go to the next slide. So in the plan itself, when you get a chance to read through it, you'll see that we expanded on each of these components. We talked a little bit about quality of life and then the idea of bringing people voices into the community process really goes into that idea of fostering community stewardship. So this plan was based a great deal on public engagement and input, both formal and informal. If you go to the next slide, Steve. Using that then to balance the idea of growth, the managing change, because as we know, change happens all the time, but it's what tools does the community have to manage that change? So balancing future growth with the physical character of the neighborhood. So looking at existing buildings, existing development patterns, street patterns, and the vision, the real ideas that people had for this neighborhood. And then wrapping that into the idea of creating a neighborhood identity. So as Steve mentioned, there's a lot of great places in here, strong neighborhood areas, but there are those areas that need a little bit of love. So how do you use East Avenue as a gateway into the neighborhoods as that strong neighborhood identity that everybody can rally around and then connect that to the coastline? So you see some of those phrases like coastal village, New England charm, quiet community. How do you translate that into a plan that governs the future of the area and then implementation plans or implementation actions? And we'll talk about 2 of those tonight, which are the zoning and design guidelines. Next slide. And then finally, making sure that this plan is coordinating with other plans and projects. So that includes the Walk Bridge program, other upgrades to East Avenue, previous planning processes, including, of course, the plan of conservation and development. And then making sure that as part of that, many of the plans that have happened already are looking at multimodal accessibility and connectivity to it. So making sure that we integrate the recommendations of the earlier plans into this plan and then take that forward. We're not starting from scratch here, but we are saying, okay, this has been done to date. What else needs to happen to really realize that community desire for a pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly, walkable area? Next slide, Steve.
Okay, so this will be, I know the commission has seen this before, so I won't go through this in too much depth and try to hit this quick. This is kind of like the executive summary of the big picture look at the major recommendations that came out of the plan, and I'll be referring back to this map on pretty much most of the slides. So the first recommendation, and Emily's going to go into this in a lot greater detail later on in the presentation, is what came out of this is a village district designation for the East Avenue corridor. So the orange hatch with the yellow outline is what we're proposing for the new village district that is right now zoned neighborhood business. So it allows residential right now, it allows commercial and mix of uses, but we think that it should be enhanced a little bit because there's a lot of this area really needs a little shot in the arm. And we think that one additional story of height and some modest density would allow that. And what we've proposed is through a village district, which gives the commission and the city oversight over design review. And excuse me, when I say commission, actually it's the zoning commission, but it gives them oversight over design review. So in addition to the zoning regulations, we also have a companion document, which is the design guidelines that outline, what the buildings can look like, how you landscape the properties, the streetscape treatments, et cetera. And it's a pretty detailed look at that, which is one of the appendices that we wanted to add on to this project. The second thing you'll see on this slide is the blue outline area is Industrial 1 zone, which runs along the railroad tracks east to west through the study area. We're also recommending as a way to enhance that commercial use and preserve it, because we found through the outreach and research we did at the beginning of the process, there's a lot of small manufacturing and warehouse and business growth in this area, and we want to enhance that and help property owners monetize their property. So we're thinking it might be a good idea to add some residential above the commercial use, but that's provided that they keep that ground floor commercial use. It's not in lieu of. The last point on this slide is number 7, which is kind of to the east of Cemetery Street. There's a couple of properties that we think are appropriate to include in the study area because it kind of wraps around the cemetery and makes like a nice closing to it, and I think it fills it in a little bit. The next area is in the Charles Street, Osborne Avenue area. We're not proposing any changes in here at all, but what we are recommending is that the city look into a facade improvement program similar to what they did in South Norwalk. And the reason being is that there's this older housing stock in this area. It's not, defined as historic in the terms of what you might be thinking of historic preservation-wise, but in many ways it provides some de facto affordable housing. So we want to try to keep that intact and try to help that, maintain its viability. An idea that came out of the study process is the potential to move the DPW garage. Now, that's not the transfer station, that's the DPW garage, which is the northern parcel. We don't have any proposal on where it could go or where it should go, but it's something the city should think about in the longer term. And then that property could get repurposed. It could go to a water-dependent commercial use. It could become parkland or something else. That would be a whole separate planning process and public outreach process that the city would have to undertake, but we think it's a good exercise for the future. You'll see several areas on the map that are labeled number 5, and what we're proposing is that these are existing neighborhood business zones that should get rezoned to C residential, because they're a little bit of outlier areas. A lot of them have residential uses now, and we'd like to concentrate the development in and around the train station and pull it out of the kind of the nether regions of the study area. Next point is the Liberty Square area is kind of a unique little spot in the city. We're not proposing any significant changes to it. We think it has great charm and great character, but we'd like to enhance it and protect it by designating it as a village district. And this has been recommended in past plans as well as the current plan. So we think that something can be done as an in-house exercise after this process is all wrapped up. Again, there's some areas in this geography that are also labeled 5, which is rezoning from MB to C residential. And one other really I thought was one of the home runs that came out of the planning concepts was this idea of a promenade along Vets Park. The city was looking at enhancing bike lanes through that area, and we talked to Public Works, and we said, what if we did something a little bit broader scale? What if we added a lot of activity? Maybe we can take some park space right along View Avenue, enhance it. Maybe it could be areas for, big gaming sites. It could be small areas for seating, could be small concert areas, could be just lots of things to do and enhance the pedestrian experience through there. It can also serve as a connector from South Norwalk to East Norwalk. And we think that would be a major plus for the city and a great asset for the whole area. And getting towards the end now, one of my favorite areas of the city is Cove Avenue around that area. It's also got some unique, charms. It almost has that like beach community feel. So similar to what we recommend for Liberty Square, we think it would be a good idea to establish a separate village district. We're not recommending any changes to the building height or the density, but just want to enhance that and protect that area. And last slide, this shows a couple of other outlier areas up towards Winfield Street, which are neighborhood business zone that we recommend going to C residential. And that is kind of wraps it up. And again, this is just to circle back. This is the plan area. You know, it's about 500 acres. What we're recommending with the village district is rezoning that to under, I think it's under 40 acres, but it's about 7% of that whole plan area. So we're not recommending wholesale changes throughout this broad area. We think East Avenue is the targeted area, which will get the most bang for our buck, which is the area that needs the most help right now, and really concentrates development in that area and pulls it out of the other parts of the study zone. And I think at this point, I'll turn it back over to Emily to go through the various zoning recommendations, some of which I highlighted, but she'll go into things with a little more detail.
Thank you, Steve. So as Steve mentioned in his discussion of the plan, there are two real rezonings that we're looking at in terms of actually changing the zoning as opposed to the zoning map. The first is looking at a modification to the I-1 district, and the second is an entirely new district. So I want to emphasize, however, that the plan and the zoning are two different things. The zoning and the design guidelines are implementation steps in the plan, but the plan is about more than just the change in zoning, as Steve went over just now. So with the I-1 zone, the real key here was understanding that there are some viable industrial businesses in the area, and that we really wanted the ability to focus on jobs in the I-1, make sure that those were protected, that the existing businesses were protected, but also understanding that industrial can sometimes be difficult to finance given other pressures on real estate. And so the idea is to allow for the flexibility of residential in the I-1 almost as an accessory use to the industrial. Certainly current market conditions, although that may change for the future, have been that residential provides a greater return for the development than industrial does in terms of the overall value. So adding some, but not a particularly large amount of residential might help to subsidize those businesses. But the key is that the existing business or the proposed industrial business must remain. You cannot have the residential without the corresponding at least ground floor industrial business. Next slide, please, Steve. So the next step is to look at the new zoning district. And we did a series of fit studies. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but we have updated, or we're in the process of updating the plan to add a more deep discussion of the fit studies. These were actually presented to the full number of fit studies were presented to the Oversight Committee first last September, and then a revised version, some of which you'll see tonight, earlier this year. So what a fit study does is it looks at creating essentially a massing study. So the buildings are pretty blocky, and it's testing to see whether or not zoning rules will work or whether the zoning rules will be too restrictive. So they are in no way an actual proposed project. They're how we test in 3 dimensions the zoning rules that we then propose. And in some cases, we modify the zoning rules, and in other cases, they work. So this is one of them. We referred to this as the Winfield test site. So Steve, if you'll move to the next slide. So you can see here, this was the updated version that we showed in January or February, building on what we'd done in September. You can see the block diagrams to the left and the parcels that we actually tested to the right. It's important to note that we used parcel assembly for this. And what that means is that instead of just testing a single parcel at a time, we were looking to see what the maximum development could be under the new rules. So we rather blithely, this is why this is not a real project, pulled together parcels that were next to each other to see what would happen if somebody bought those parcels and used the same zoning on it. And in this case, we're showing the ability for these parcels to also incorporate some of the amenities that we were testing at the time. So if you remember at the beginning, I'd said that one of the goals was to ensure a pedestrian-friendly environment, and considering amenities that would contribute to that pedestrian-friendly environment. The key here was to try and tie those amenities to the zoning such that there was a bonus provision in exchange for the amenities. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But what you're seeing here is some of the amenities that came up in conversation. We're testing to see if they are physically possible on this site. You'll also see down in the lower right-hand corner, we were looking at potential bonus provisions by testing your residential density limitations, where the number of dwelling units is limited by the lot size. And so in this case, the number of dwelling units is assigned a particular square footage, which is divided into the lot size, and that gives you the maximum number of dwelling units allowed. That's not necessarily the number of dwelling units you can achieve, and that's one of the other things tested. Next slide, please. So this is a different version. You can see that the building dimensions changed in that upper left-hand corner, and you can see that the lot size changed in the lower right-hand corner. And again, we're testing to see will our amenities work. In this case, you can see that public parking and arcade didn't, but public art and green infrastructure, for example, did. We're also testing the floor area ratio, which is the ratio of the building square footage to the lot square footage, and the building coverage, or the amount of the lot that the building actually covers. Your zoning has two restrictions, one on building coverage and one on parking coverage. And so throughout this period, we were testing those as well. Next slide, please, Steve. And so here are some of the images that you'll also see in the plan that we use to try and capture the pedestrian experience of actually being on the ground. So what you're looking at is those same studies that you saw in yellow and red, which were coded to land uses, red for retail or commercial and yellow for residential. Now we're showing, this was on the right-hand side, what it would look if you were able to sort of hover as a drone and look down. And on the left-hand side, what it would look like if you were actually physically on the street. And we've used both of these techniques to give us, and obviously people viewing it, an idea of how potential zoning could look. The buildings really have sort of minimal architectural detail on them, just to give you a sense of what the feel would be. But again, this is for illustrative purposes and is not an actual project. Next slide, please, Steve. So here's the zone itself, which is, as Steve noted, a much smaller part of the overall area. We based it on your existing neighborhood business district and had a look at some of the other recent zoning changes you've done around the city to make sure that we were consistent with those. And we're really trying to tie the potential new development to the desired community benefits. So again, focusing on that pedestrian environment, but not just on that. So by creating an incentive for a bonus that's tied to the amenities, you're also creating an incentive to redevelop underutilized properties. So that would be either vacant properties or properties where the building isn't at the full amount that could fit on that site, or reuse existing buildings. And what this does is it adds in a single story. So we're going from the 2.5 that's allowed as of right today to 3.5 stories. And then we're altering the square footage required in terms of your residential density limitation. I'll show you that in a little bit. But we are also requiring commercial uses on the ground floor, and that's for two reasons. One, East Avenue is the main street of this collection of neighborhoods in East Norwalk. And so we want that to be the commercial street. That's where we want people to walk to get goods and services and coffee and pick up a bottle of milk on the way home or whatever they need, or stop by a restaurant on their way home. And it also creates that activity on the street level. So it makes it a friendlier pedestrian environment. There's something to look at, but there's also eyes on the street from that retail activity. And it requires, in addition to the commercial uses on the ground floor, these public amenities, which I'll show you in a minute. And finally, we've established design guidelines that says if you're going to build here, Not only do you have to meet the zoning requirements, but under the village district legislation from the Connecticut state statutes, you also have to meet these design guidelines, and I'll show you those in a minute. Next slide, please. So here it is again, just in the wider context. So you can see really centered on the train station. That's the 1/4 mile and the 1/2 mile walk radius that we use. So the entire, almost the entire village district is within about a 5-minute walk from one end to the other. And that's really that walkable level that we're looking for. Next slide, please. So the idea of requiring ground floor uses, now we don't want those ground floor uses stretching into the neighborhoods on either side. So we're really trying to do something that's an urban design principle of capturing the corners and making sure that we've covered East Avenue. So you see where the yellow lines are is where we're looking for those ground floor uses. And the idea is that the activity steps down from East Avenue as you move into the established residential neighborhoods. It also creates what we call mini gateways. So as you're approaching East Avenue from the neighborhoods, you get this sense that you're arriving into the East Avenue area. And then thinking about wider sidewalks to create this neighborhood center along East Avenue to make sure, again, that that is the pedestrian friendly, real center to the village. Next slide, please. So we did add and remove some uses. We added government agencies, maker spaces, artist workspaces, cultural arts and entertainment facilities, partly because they're appropriate for a village center and partly because as we look at the ebb and flow of retail over time, especially in the what we're in now with the pandemic, we wanted to make sure that active uses weren't just limited to retail only. And that there was a real flexibility in the types of active uses. So thinking about what else drives activity to a ground floor and what else would be appropriate for the sort of a tight knit center of this neighborhood. We removed uses, single and 2 family dwellings, which are allowed under neighborhood business because the neighborhoods around them supply that. And we're looking for the higher density along East Avenue. Marinas, because there's no water access in this village district, and also all standalone off-street parking facilities. So parking has to be a use. You can't just have a parking garage there as the sole use of a property. It has to be, parking has to be the accessory uses. That's because we're really not seeing that as appropriate for the center of this village. Next slide, please. We also added some additional restrictions on the preservation and adaptive reuse of historic buildings. So there's certain requirements that they're now exempt from, and the key piece that they may also receive dimensional waivers to allow for those adaptive reuses. In addition, for the multifamily, we're requiring bicycle storage and electric vehicle charging on site, and that 10 units or more requires a special permit. And that goes back to that idea of community control for the city to be able to hold public hearings on a larger development and have the multiple voices in the process. Next slide, please. So this gives an idea of the dimensional standards. So as I said, a special permit is going to be required for a mixed use building. So as of right, you have 35 feet, 2.5 stories, no change from the current regulations. Floor area ratio of 0.7, also no change. And your current lot area and square footage per dwelling unit is 1 unit per 1,650 square feet of lot area. That's all based on the neighborhood business, and there's no change to that in the zoning. Where the change comes is in the special permit process. And as I mentioned, we have a point-based system. Right now, we're suggesting 50 points takes you to the first, 15, sorry, points takes you to the first level and 20 to the second level. Now, it's important to realize that the zoning and the design guidelines are an appendix to the plan because we're capturing sort of what we're recommending at this point. We fully expect that during the discussion process for the approval of the zoning and the design guidelines, that these specific points are likely to change. So they may go up, they may go down, but what we're doing is giving you sort of the introduction to how this works, understanding that there are still community conversations to happen. So the way it's structured now is if you reach 15 amenity points, you hit the first level of the special permit under which you can apply. That increases the building height to 45 feet, 3.5 stories. That 45 feet is specifically to allow for a pitched roof. If we'd capped it at 40 feet and 3.5 stories, or 3 stories, you would have almost certainly gotten a flat roof. 45 feet also allows for the higher floor to floor height of a ground floor. We're noticing that ground floors tend to be 15 to 20 feet floor to floor now to accommodate restaurant and retail, and in some cases, perhaps light industrial. So 45 gives you a little bit more flexibility there. The floor area ratio goes up to 1.1. That's based on the FIT studies. And the lot area per dwelling unit goes up a little bit, or goes down a little bit, to 1,035 square feet. So instead of a maximum of 26 units, you would get a maximum of 42 units. 20 points from amenities gets you the same height, a slightly higher floor area ratio, and a slightly lower residential density requirement to get you up to 52 units. Now, it's really important to note that just because you have a maximum of dwelling units, you're not necessarily going to be able to get there. And what our FIT studies showed is because of the relationship of just the parcel shape and the configuration, but also the relationship of your other requirements, the maximum building coverage, the required ground floor commercial uses, parking, FAR, building height, market demand, all of that, that you rarely got anywhere close to the maximum number of units. I will say that some of our FIT studies also came up with a floor area ratio of higher than 1.5, but in listening to the community, we recognized that that was probably a better limit than the higher versions. I think we had maybe one up to 1.6 or so. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show you how the Winfield scenarios played out, and looking at this, as again, there were multiple parcels in there, which is why you have such a high square footage in terms of lot area. You see that the maximum dwelling units range from 69 to 138, depending on which of those ratios you apply. But in fact, the estimated dwelling units was much lower than that. In part, that's because the ground floor is dedicated entirely to retail in our FIT study, or commercial. And a certain number of spaces were required for parking at surface level, so that also pushed it back. We also put in a higher number of parking for than was required, because we needed the parking for the commercial as well as for the residential. So again, these are just illustrative to allow us to test. They are not actual projects, but it gives you an idea of the range of buildings and what you can do with this. Somebody else, a different designer, would have done a different method of calculating the buildings and probably come up with something a little bit different. Next slide, please. So here's the point system. When you review the zoning, you'll see that what we've done is we've assigned specific points to each of these. Again, we expect that's likely to change during the public conversations on this. One of them, and there, I think you can think of them as being broken into a couple of different ranges. One is this idea of the pedestrian amenities, which we mentioned before. One is having sustainable development in the area. That was something else we heard was really important in the public forums. And another was this idea of certain uses that the community wanted to have in the area. Now, some of those uses, you can't really zone uses, right? I can't tell somebody in zoning that you must put X use on the ground floor, but you can create the conditions that would help somebody perhaps bring that use in here. So we heard a grocery store, we heard post office, we heard cafe, I think a couple of other uses. So that first point is relative to that is the idea that one of the amenities could be a rent reduction for ground floor tenants to bring in a tenant who might not be able to afford to come in under a market rate situation. In terms of green development standards, I mentioned some of them already, but we also looked at LEED Silver and site certification. In terms of pedestrian amenities, we did hear that people wanted pedestrian-friendly environments throughout the seasons. So we've identified both indoor and outdoor pedestrian amenities. And the idea is you would get a certain number of points depending on how many you brought of those amenities you installed, and discussions over whether there should be a minimum number of amenities. Other pieces that came into the idea of this being a village center is public and shared parking facilities, and some additional ideas that came forward sort of as we were discussing the draft zoning was considering how to include affordable housing and other community benefits in there. Maybe there's one of the active ground floor uses could be a community meeting room, for example. And I think all of these could continue to be worked into the public discussion of the zoning during that specific process. Next slide, please. So here are just some of the images that we used in the zoning itself to call people's attention to certain features ranging from water features, which we've heard are problematic for some people in the wintertime if they're outdoor water features, but of course we also recommend potential indoor water features in indoor seating areas. Shaded seating, we heard, was very important to people. And you also have powered seating that allows people to charge their batteries. Water fillers, I think sanitation stations are certainly something that we've seen images of popping up in places now. So that could be something to be added there. And in that top right is a stormwater management system that is also an integrated art and garden design. So it shows a way that some of these things can be put together. Stormwater doesn't have to be hidden. It can also be visible and actually part of a feature for the area. So next slide, please. So in terms of the design guidelines, that's a separate appendix, Appendix E in the process. And this is really based on Connecticut General Statute, Section 8-2J for village districts. The key is protecting and enhancing the distinctive historic design character, landscape, historic structures, density, and development pattern within the neighborhood. So we want to keep that the relationship of buildings and streets and views going as new development comes in, and not have new development change that. So next slide, please. So first of all, we call out the types of buildings that we've seen in the area. These are just some sources, one in Massachusetts and one in Connecticut, where we're looking at those pitched roofs, the traditional materials, the ability for the massing of the buildings to be broken up. For example, that red building in the lower center is actually, I think, ends up being 3.5 stories in one part and 2 in the others. It's actually all one building and it stretches to the back. But as a pedestrian, you don't feel that because it's got a lot of human scaled elements to it. The building on the far right, lower, those 3 separate buildings could easily be a single building connected in the back. But again, you don't notice that from the pedestrian. The upper buildings from Saugatuck are also broken up so that they are lower, closer to the street, and taller further away, and very traditional New England seaside elements used in both. Next slide, please. Some other design guidelines. So we broke this, the design guidelines section into different elements. So first of all, looking at the overall building massing and form and the elements there. And again, you can see a couple of residential and commercial buildings. In some cases, it's hard to tell which is which because it's the form of the building that matters in this case and not the use. And others, like the upper right there, it's very easy to tell that that's got a significant commercial component to it because of the level of glass. Next slide, please. We also broke it down into storefronts. So here we're looking at a traditional 3-part or tripartite scheme of a base of the storefront, then the windows, and then an upper element, which could be an awning or a sign band. That again breaks it down to a more human scale. You're looking at inset entries, so people step into the building before they open the door. outdoor seating on the left, which does require the wider sidewalks. So again, that goes back to creating that friendly, active pedestrian environment. Next slide, please. And then we wanted to talk about using landscape in parking. So rather than having huge fields of asphalt, sometimes any asphalt looks large if it's not unrelieved, working in on-site stormwater management and landscape plantings to really soften the edges of parking, capture the stormwater so it doesn't enter the city's stormwater management system. And this is part of that sustainable design that we were talking about, low impact development in terms of parking and the edges between parking and sidewalk. Again, note the lighting, note the soft edges along the sidewalk to make that a more pleasant pedestrian experience. On the left-hand side, you've got this nice sort of community gathering space right next to the parking, and it's appropriately lit, landscaped, and shaded. Next slide, please. And then starting to think about street furniture. What are those components that make it nice to be in a village? Seating, whether contemporary is shown here or traditional, bike racks, so people have a place to store their bike when they've biked from their homes or from the train station on the way to home and pick something up. The ability to recycle their trash, to compact it so that you don't have overflowing trash bins. Next slide, please. And then a key part of the discussions was the discussion with the DPW of actually having not just guidelines, but standards for the public realm. So we worked with Vanessa to figure out what would be appropriate standards for East Avenue that would be similar to what's in the rest of the city, but not exactly the same. So that East Avenue, this is back to that idea of identity, East Avenue would have its own identity. You know, when you cross the gateway into this part of East Norwalk. So you see the paving for the crosswalk there is actually slightly different. They're both gray throughout Norwalk for the standards, but the pattern in this case is slightly different. The use of the colored pavers around the tree pits there, again, that's similar. There's a similar standard of the that outline, that edging elsewhere in the city, but it's not this particular standard. So you have a consistency and yet a little bit of a changed identity. Next slide, please. Yep. So sorry, I thought I had one more on there. We also picked a Lumiere, which is the light part of a lamppost, where the base is the same as the rest of the city, but the Lumiere is slightly different. You'll find that in the pages on the design guidelines. These are just the sources of the images I showed in case you wanted more information about them. And next slide. And I think that's back over to you, Steve.
Sorry, I think I might have deleted out one of your slides by accident. I'm sorry about that.
That's all right, don't worry about it.
So kind of just to touch on a couple of things quickly. There are a lot of other things in the plan besides what we went through. So there, you know, there's an extensive section that talks about pedestrian connections, bicycle connections, and how to make those work better, overall transportation, economic development. But for the purposes of this meeting and the other meetings, this seems to be the, you know, what everybody wants to talk about. But so that's really why we included, you know, the presentation we put together. Emily mentioned this, and I mentioned this as well. It's really important to stress that the zoning recommendations and the design guidelines are going to go through a separate process after the plan is adopted. So that has to go back to the zoning commission. So they'll talk about the design guidelines, they'll talk about the zoning again, and then that gets referred back to the planning commission another time. So there's another public hearing process that's going to happen subsequent to this about those specific recommendations. What we wanted to do by including the zoning recommendations and the design guidelines as detailed as they are right now is to really put a good framework and a good base in place. So that way we're not starting from scratch. I know that a lot of plans will, you know, stop at, you know, a generic recommendation on increasing height or increasing density, but we wanted to get into specifics on what that could and should look like, because that was a major concern at the very outset of the process was, what are you guys actually thinking and recommending for this area? So I think, at least in my mind and in the way I've been talking since the beginning of this process, this is kind of consistent from what I've said from day one. I didn't have a specific recommendation on density, but I knew, the kind of height and, overall scale that would work for this area versus other parts of the city. And lastly, throughout the planning process, we had several public meetings at the beginning. Obviously, this was pre-COVID, when we can all get together in a large room and talk about things. And there were some different planning concepts that came out of this that Emily's team had put together. So they were talking about a community of nodes, side street villages, and East Avenue as a main street. So they all had their pros and their cons and their fans and detractors. But we kind of tried to combine the positive elements of all of those into the draft zoning that you see. And that's why we came up with the recommendations that you're discussing tonight. That's all I have presentation-wise, Madam Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions from the commission at this point.
Any commissioners have any questions?
We do have some people that typed in questions. We can take those first or do those last if you want to hear from anybody who actually wants to, be allowed to speak or popped on to speak, however you want to handle that.
Well, how many people are signed up right now? Or can you tell how many people are logged on to speak?
There's 5 written questions in the queue. I mean, we can go through those quick, and right now there's 1, maybe 2 people with their hands raised to speak. So, you're under 10 total. So, I mean, you didn't talk about a drop dead time. It's 7:20. I mean, we have a second hearing scheduled for next Monday. We're not going to go through the presentation again. We're just going to open it back up to comment, and I'll address any questions or issues that we don't have answers for tonight. But we should have, if we wrap up by 9 o'clock, we should have plenty of time to get through, the questions I see so far.
Okay, so my target time was 9 o'clock, depending on how many people were signed up. Also, I'm not going to cut you off. I'm not going to cut anybody off. I appreciate everybody logging in and participating. Please stick to the subject at hand, and any question that you have, Dr. with Steve will be answering them as they come up. So, Steve, why don't you go through the written questions, and then we'll go to the live, if you will.
Okay, I'll read them off, and Emily and I will kind of handle them as they come up. This one is from East Norwalk resident. Says, for the benefit of the public who are observing and or speaking, can you ask her, I'm assuming that's Emily, to present all the fit test sites that they did? Only a handful, shouldn't take too long. So for the purpose of the presentation, we just didn't want to go through each one of those. Emily, do you want to comment any more than that? I mean, they'll be in the plan, correct?
The majority of them will be in the plan. Yeah, we had done multiple scenarios for multiple sites. So I'd picked the ones that we took forward to test the amenities with and added those to the plan. But you're right, we would have been here a lot longer if I'd gone through all of them.
And the next is a comment. So a modest increase in density is double allowable density for these points. I can answer that. Yes, I have characterized this as moderate and targeted from the outset. If you think about, if you're familiar with rezoning that we did in South Norwalk, which was 2 years ago, and then West Avenue, Wall Street, which was a little over a year ago now, that area in South Norwalk was over 50 acres that we rezoned at a much higher density and a much higher height. West Ave was over 120 acres, again, similar height, sometimes maybe even triple the allowed height that we're having here, and a much greater density, and also lower parking allowances. So you will not see the kind of development that you see in South Norwalk. That was not the intent. We understand this is a different area with a different makeup, a different consideration, but we think it's appropriate for the area that's under consideration. The next one is from Tracy Barkley. The area by Goldstein Place should be deemed a historic district with some kind of emphasis on the Native American fort being in that area. It should be highlighted and tied into tourism of Norwalk. That's a really good point. Yeah, so when we get to the second phase, which will be looking at Goldstein Place, so we can look at a historic district versus a village district, there's pros and cons to each, but yeah, that's a good point. We'll definitely look into that. Anna Tabit, I'm going to mispronounce this, I apologize. Anna Tabitschneck, I'm sorry. This looks great. Where would the curb cuts at the corners and bumps for people with vision challenges? So all these pedestrian improvements and street improvements that are laid out in the plan, those will get further detailed study and engineering review by Department of Public Works when they get into those kind of phases. So one good strong point about doing a plan like this is when we go to do capital budget funding or look for grant funding, we can point back to this plan to say, okay, well, in 2020, we adopted a plan for this area and it had these street improvements in it. And the state, for example, on grants likes to see that the city is just not coming up with these pie in the sky projects, that they've put some thought into this and put some effort in their own funds into this. This is from Cleo. What is the proposed development for the Wells Fargo Bank on Cemetery Street? There is no active proposal. There's definitely, I would imagine if this plan and the zoning regulations at some point get adopted, that you'll see a project for that area and they'd like to develop that. That's, you know, it's a large site with a lot of asphalt and a small building on it. So I imagine that they will want to do something at some point. Similar question, why was the Wells Fargo lot not included in the requirement for activated ground floor? We left that site out because we didn't feel that was a need to pull the commercial down to that point. I mean, if that's the direction that any of the commissions thought was really needed, I mean, it's easy enough to do that, but we just felt it wasn't really necessary. Next one is from Lisa. What thought, if any, has been given to traffic patterns and problems that increased density will cause between the East Norwalk area and the entrance to the highway? Yeah, we heard traffic loud and clear throughout the whole process. We understand. I've walked to the train station at rush hour a dozen times. I've driven up and down that stretch. We know traffic's challenging. There are roadway improvements that are scheduled to occur as part of the walk bridge program, because they are going to replace the East Avenue train bridge. That will alleviate a lot of those issues. And at some point, the on-ramp and off-ramp at exit 16 needs to get fixed, which will improve those. We are cognizant of that. Any one of these projects that's significant that comes in for a special permit is going to have to submit their own traffic study. As part of that city process that we adopted a couple of years ago is that there is a peer review done by an outside peer review traffic consultant. That's the city's consultant that works for us. And they will review that to make sure that what is being proposed does not cause any impacts on traffic. Next one from Dev Desai. We're getting more written than verbal, so we'll just keep going with this for now because it's kind of quick. Could we try to get some sustainability guidelines in terms of materials, water, native landscaping, and energy use? Would we consider designating this at 2030 district to encourage a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by that year? We didn't get that far in terms of the 2030 carbon emissions, but there are a lot of incentives for green infrastructure, for reduction of car trips and so forth. So I think as far as our planning goes, I think this goes a little further. Emily, I don't know if you want to discuss that point any further.
Yeah, I would just add that in addition to some of the stuff worked into the base zoning, like the requirements for bike racks, for electric charging vehicles, the idea of making the ability to qualify for LEED Silver or site certification, both of which address many of these issues as one of the bonus provisions, certainly talks to this desire for additional sustainability. I would say that something that the commission could consider if they wanted to is upping the number of points that you get for doing that. to indicate its importance. But I think that will come out of your conversations as you go through the draft zoning and look more into and evaluate more of the bonus structures that we've set up.
Next is a question about the View Avenue Promenade. How will the city protect the surrounding residents' right to quiet enjoyment? So I'm assuming you're thinking if there's, it's built out and there's activities, during the day, I'm sure they'll, if there's people outside and walking, it'll be more active and, it'll be a little maybe noisier. I mean, there's a public park there, so there's no guarantee that in the future the city won't repurpose that park for something else that might have more noise. I mean, obviously anything that occurs there has to comply with the city's noise ordinance, and then we definitely will be cognizant of, people do live across the street. We understand that, so we're not proposing any, loud music venues or any concerts or anything like that. This is recommending just activating that street area and activating that walkway into something greater. I'm sorry, that was from Roberta. This one is from Cheryl Ward. Have you sought advice or reviewed plans from other towns that have already accomplished a similar plan, such as Old Greenwich or Darien? We look at these plans all the time as they come up. Emily can chime in too. We see these things. We did look at these other communities for what they did for their design, and also we looked at for peer review for density. Darien, for example, has been adding some TOD type developments, and in some instances are bigger or broader and more dense than what we're proposing. Obviously not on the scale we're talking about for South Norwalk, but in terms of East Norwalk, some of these do line up with that. This one is from Diana Palladino. Is there a timeline to phase 2 with this project? There's not really a phase 2. The zoning regulations and the design guidelines will be on a separate subsequent approval track, because they, anytime you amend the zoning regulations, that's an entirely different process. So even though this plan contains zoning regulations, it doesn't mean that they're automatically adopted and in place. That's a separate public hearing process that will take place. Okay. The next one's from Scott. How are we accommodating parking for the train? So there's existing parking at the train station. When the development under construction at 230 East Avenue is complete, there will be hopefully additional commuter parking there as well. We understand that, parking is at a premium in East Norwalk, and so at the train station. So what we're trying to recommend within the plan is to try to maximize that in shared parking as much as possible. I don't know if there'll be any additional structured parking for commuters specifically. It's a tight lot there with the right-of-ways for the train station, but we're definitely open up to that in the beginning.
Steve, I think you skipped one on wider sidewalks. It just disappeared.
Oh, sorry, I marked that as answered.
That's all right.
I didn't see that one.
So it was, the question was from Scott too, is how can we accommodate wider sidewalks on East Ave and widening the road to 4 lanes?
Yeah, I don't have the engineering plans to address that, but one of the requirements of any redevelopment in this area is that they do have to provide 7-foot wide sidewalks. And that is exclusive of any pedestrian area that they include as part of an amenity package if they decided to go that route. So that is required. The specific roadway widths, they've all been looked at by Connecticut DOT as well as DPW. So there is a plan for the multi-lanes as well as a bike lane access through that area. Okay, I'm not sure about this one, but I'll read it. From East Norwalk resident, public hearings don't usually allow audience questions being answered by, there it goes, scrolling on me, sorry. Public hearings don't usually allow audience questions being answered by staff. This is a great improvement. We'll take that as a compliment. Will the chair also use this format next week? And also, will you open the floor to public comments instead of just questions? Yeah, so we're going to let the public, there's more. When I first suggested we do the written comments, there was like 4. Now there's it's quadrupled. So we'll keep rattling these off, and then I'll let the chair answer that question and that any juncture she chooses to. Have you asked the question, how do we get people out of their cars to get to and from the highway area to the plan to the train station, to the beach, to places like Stu Leonard's? We did do some, intercept polling at the train station, try to figure out why people are driving versus the train. Now that a lot of that's kind of up in the air with where COVID is, train ridership and bus ridership is slowly coming back. It's not nearly at the levels as it was pre-COVID. I think part of the answer to that is we provide the environment where they feel safe and want to walk and bike. So I think that's one component of the plan. And I think having people living in proximity to the train station will increase that as well.
Hey,
This is
Steve,
from Scott.
how many written comments do you have right now?
Brian, do you know how many are down below?
We have about,
7 more, it looks like.
yeah, a few are like not questions. So there's about four more left.
All right, you want to do those 4 and then open it up for public, just traditional
Yep.
public comment?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, Brian, you tell me when. The next one is from Scott. Where in our city governance structure are tax impacts of zoning changes quantified and explored or simulated? So that is not a specific requirement. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by tax impacts. So on some developments, and we're encouraging and asking them to do that now, is we ask them to do kind of fiscal impact analysis, where they will look at the existing uses in the existing properties and provide, here's what the city's getting at for taxes now. And then they'll provide an analysis of, if we redevelop under this scenario, here's what you'll see for a tax. They, depending on the development, we will also ask them to look at, school impacts, so we understand what, based on the economics and the projections that the Board of Ed has put together, how many kids would be entering the school system for a development like this and what that would cost. So those all get weighed in that. In terms of other impacts, there's also sewer, there's also road. Those get factored in as part of the city review in terms of city and sewer impacts, and those are also touched on in the plan as well. This is from Lisa.
Steve, hold on. One thing I noticed, at public hearings, we require name and address. Now, on these questions, do we have everybody's name, or we got no names on these things?
Most of them have first and last name, some just first, and some are not giving names. Brian, are you able to capture all this too?
Yeah, but
Yeah, I can capture it. Yeah.
we've always
Okay.
required people to give names and address. If they're gonna send, I don't want anonymous things, okay? People are gonna contribute or whatever, put your name there. That's what our public hearings have been. We've always required names and address. So if you're mailing a question in, please use your name, okay? Go ahead.
Okay, this is from Elisa. So if you could give us your last name at some point. The question is, if the focus is on livability in neighborhood, why the stress on increasing building heights, which would have a negative impact on current residents who live near or along the edges of the plan? My opinion, I don't think it's going to have a negative impact. And I'm not naive in saying that there obviously, if you add people, that there's not more cars on the road. Yes, there probably will be, but we think that a lot of that will get mitigated by the street improvements that are proposed. There's a lot of other facets to livability as well. So if you go down East Avenue now from the train station up to 95, there's not a lot of reason for people to go there. There's not, it's hard for people to pinpoint uses, buildings, properties, areas to congregate. There's really, that's kind of the sore thumb of that area. So we think enhancing that will enhance the livability and walkability and make the whole area rise up, not just East Avenue. This is from a Dev Desai. I think we have 2 more, Brian. Okay. Thank you. One more question. Are there any plans to expedite a sidewalk on both sides of East Avenue as it crosses under the railroad tracks? My fellow commuters and I literally risk our lives to get from the cemetery side to the New York bound train station platform every morning by walking between cars and the stone wall of the bridge. Unfortunately, we're at the mercy of DOT on when when they work on the East Avenue Bridge, because the bridge will allow a wider roadway through there, which will also allow the sidewalks and the increased road width. So when that happens, that's when the other road improvements will take place. Last question from Anna again, and Tabachnek, I'm sorry, I apologize. Is there a way we can share our addresses privately? Well, just a heads up, if you send me your addresses, it's not technically not private. I mean, if somebody really wanted to research that, they could submit a Freedom of Information request, and I'd be required to do that. So I guess now, if you want, Fran, we could kick it back over to the speakers.
I hate to interrupt, but there's one from Patricia Prince that's been hovering sort of towards the bottom for a little while.
Oh, she's got her hand up too, so I don't know if we just want
Maybe
to.
she's doing it that way. Okay.
Yeah, so we got, there's a Lou who's got hand raised, and then Patricia. And then if we don't get any others, I'm happy to go back and take more of the written ones at whatever, but at the chair's pleasure.
Okay, let's go to some live. They've been, everybody's been plugged in. Go ahead.
All right, so if you do want to participate live, to raise your hand, you use the raise your hand function. And if you're called in on a telephone, you dial *9 and it will raise your hand, and then I can bring you over. So again, just remember to say your name and address when you come over. You there, Lou?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much. My name is Luis Garcia. I reside at 15 Bond Street in East Norwalk. And I want to thank, first of all, Steve and the committee and everybody for being able to listen to my comments tonight. I have quite a preparation that I've been doing to do this tonight. Just to start off, like I said before, my name is Luis Garcia. I'm an architect. I have 30 years experience working in the architectural field. I'm also been a resident of Norwalk, East Norwalk for the past 50 years. So I have a pretty good sense of what we have in East Norwalk, and also have a really good sense of what it is that all these requirements and changes that Steve and Emily just went through. Because I myself, being an architect, being on the other side of this project, I've been the architect in charge of projects similar to this, and the reason for being here tonight is because I think the public needs to hear sort of a different version of what was presented today. And I think it's important for everyone to hear it, especially the committee who's going to be making some of the decisions on whether this thing is going to get approved or not. So the first thing I want to say is that I've gone through the entire proposal, item by item, page by page. I spent quite a few hours analyzing, looking at it, because I wanted to be prepared tonight. And the first thing I want to say is that I do like a lot of the stuff that is being proposed on this proposal. I think Emily and her company did a wonderful job showing a lot of very good things that can happen with East Norwalk. I am not totally against this project. I think there's a good 90%. I think it's a very well thought out, and I think it's workable. However, there are some problems with it, and that's what I want to address today. And as I was listening to all the presentation, I couldn't help to not hear the fact that the biggest problem that I see with this project is the requirement for parking. And I know Steve kind of just rushed it off and said, well, we're all going to have to live with having to walk to the train station and having to have a community where everybody's going to be walking and being very friendly to each other. And I think that's a wonderful thought. I think it's a wonderful thought. But in reality, the fact of the matter is that we all live in suburbia, and we all need to have cars. We all need to go to shopping as to Leonard's. We all need to go to the new mall. We all need to go to the doctor's appointments. We all need cars. The fact of the matter is that you're just going to, propose this thing and not worry about what the parking is going to be. I think it's not really the proper way to go about thinking about this project. The reason parking doesn't work, and it's based on my own experience. I've worked on East Avenue and East Norwalk, is that if you take East Avenue, it's already narrow to begin with. And I understand that the East Avenue is going to be made wider by the state, which I think is going to be a good thing to do. However, if you look at the plans and drawings and that were being presented today, East Avenue, and I'm only concentrating on the East Avenue corridor. I think the rest of the project, I think, is fine. Seaview and everything else, it looks good. But East Avenue is the one I want to concentrate on because I think it's what the one that has the problem is that it's a very narrow strip of land. You have East Avenue, you have a couple of lots of parcels, and then you abutting a residential area, you know, along the streets that go perpendicular to East Avenue. So developers and people who are going to be actually working on these projects do not have a whole lot of land to work with. And that's what we need. When you are doing parking layouts, and I've done zillions of them, you need to be able to dedicate parking spaces for a parking space, for a turnaround, to be able to get in and out of these buildings. The next thing that's flawed here is that if you put in, which I think is a wonderful idea, commercial on the first level, which I think, as Steve said, is going to be a requirement for any developer or anyone to do this. And if they want to do residential work on the upper floors, you're going to need to have commercial on the first floor. Well, I don't think you can have them both. How are you going to be able to create parking for units above if you're using that space for commercial use? And the idea of doing a higher FAR, and let me explain to some of the people that listen what floor area ratio means. Floor area ratio in the simplest form means that a developer is going to ask an architect like myself to please put as much units as possibly allowed by code so he can get more units out of his building. That is the basics of this. I work with these developers on a regular basis. And the idea that this might not be, that Emily was saying that some of these developers are not going to reach the requirements shown on these charts is incorrect. These developers are looking for maximizing their space for profitability. That's how they make money. Okay, so adding additional FAR and adding additional space to this location is not the right thing to do. By adding additional space and increasing the store from 2.5 stories to 3 stories, you're asking for more units. If I have a developer come in and say to me, Mr. Garcia, I need you to work with 3.5 stories and FAR of 0.92 or 1.0, that's not a discrepancy on this report, they're going to look to me to make sure that we maximize those requirements. And by doing so, you're going to require more parking spaces. And by requiring more parking spaces, you're not going to be able to put them anywhere. The fact of the matter is that this project in this location does not work for those reasons. I think that the city has done a wonderful job in other locations in Norwalk. My son just moved out to the Glover Apartments over there on the other side of town. Wonderful project. You go in there and you got plenty of parking. You got plenty of amenities. You got plenty of an area where doesn't abut a residential zone. That's the right location for this type of development. There's others. Avalon is good. We have Avalon here in Norton's, which is also a good location. Out of sight, doesn't really interfere with the traffic flow, doesn't interfere with the neighbors. Good project. And the one over there on Wall Street, by the water, again, good projects. This project, for the reason I just mentioned, does not work for the reasons of the 3.5 stories height, and also the additional requirement for the FAR, and most importantly for the parking. And I can look at my notes here. Now I did go through the Appendix E, which is the one that Emily referred to as far as what some of the architectural requirements are going to be. And I made some comments, and I kind of like to comment on that for a minute. I mentioned the idea that there's supposed to be a scale of massing on the proposed buildings, and they want to go from 2.5 stories to 3.5 stories. I don't think that's correct. The other thing is that you got to keep in mind you're abutting a residential zone. So let's say most of those houses are maybe 25, 30 feet tall at the very tallest. and you want to put in under special conditions, 3.5 stories, 45 feet high, these things are going to tower over the adjacent houses. They're going to tower over the adjacent houses. Now, Emily also was showing a very nice bunch of perspectives and pictures. Again, for example, the perspective that shows the building on Winfield Street and East Avenue, very nice rendering. But it really doesn't work. And the reason, again, is because it doesn't have any parking. And this issue of the amenities, let's talk about that for a minute. And I think somebody brought this up before. If you widen East Avenue and you only have a finite amount of space to work with as a developer or as an owner, then where are you going to be able to make a 7-foot wide sidewalk and be able to put all these other amenities that they're talking about? It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. You got roof, you got gardens, you got the gardens that they talked about. Great thing. I've done them, but they're not going to be able to fit into this location. It just doesn't work. The other things I wanted to just kind of do, and I know I'm going to be lengthy here, but
Mr. Garcia, hold on. Now, you've spoken for 10 minutes or so. How much longer do you have?
2 more minutes. Okay. So what I wanted to stress to the people that are listening tonight, and also to the commission, is that we, as the people of East Norwalk, and someone who's been here for 50 years, I think that we believe that we definitely need to have some improvements in East Norwalk, okay, and East Avenue, and I'm all for that. But we have to be cautious about how it's done, because once these regulations get passed, we all know that this whole issue of the special permits and this whole issue of review by other people are going to go by the wayside. Steve and I are dealing with a developer over here in Winfield Street near my house, where he wants to maximize that lot already from an allowable 12 units to 70 units. Now, again, this is a perfect example of a greedy developer trying to maximize what he can do, and that's what's going to happen here. My fear is that if we allow this to happen, we're going to have these developers come in. They're going to put up all these units. There's going to be no parking anywhere. We're going to have a tremendous congestion on East Norwalk because the traffic jam is going to become such that no one's going to be able to move from the cemetery or from the train station to exit 16. Already as it is, there's starting to traffic to build up, and it's just, we're not going to be able to move. And then what's going to happen is that these developers are going to rent out these apartments to people who are going to be bringing their cars, no matter what anyone says, and they're going to be parking these cars on everyone's street that abuts East Avenue. So anyone who's listening to me who lives in those areas, you better be ready to have tons of cars parked on your streets, because there's going to be nowhere else to put these cars. And I think ultimately what's going to happen here is there's going to become a highly densely popular area that no one's going to want to live, because no one can find a place to park their car, or and it's going to start to look empty and deserted again, like we have on Wall Street. And eventually, I think it's going to be a deterrent to the life and the well-being of East Norwalk. And I strongly believe that this commission should take this into account. Now, a couple of things that I just want to finish one thing. A couple of things that I want to.
Mr. I can't give. You're going on to 15 minutes. Okay,
right.
So I need you to wrap it up.
I'm gonna wrap it up. I think as an architect, there's a couple of things that I think that this committee can do and the commission can do. One is that ask additional architects and people in my profession about what they do actually think about this proposal, and get some feedback from them, not just me, but some other architects, and see what happens. Item number 2 is that you could require that any developer that is interested in doing any kind of projects on East Avenue has to provide parking as required by today's planning and zoning standards with absolutely no exceptions, or provide a municipal parking lot that everyone can use. And that, for example, can take place if somebody bought out the St. Thomas school and put a park in there, a 2-story, nice looking parking that can fit in with the rest of the neighborhood. I think that would be also a valuable option. And 3 is we can put a moratorium like we've done in this town before, and on this kind of development, this kind of 3-story, higher density for the time being, until we figure out what is going to happen with the rest of these large projects that are going around the entire city of Norwalk. And so we don't end up with all these apartments that are going to be just left empty because there's surplus of apartments for this area. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Frank, can I get a couple minutes to respond to that?
Sorry, yes, go ahead, Steve, sorry.
And Emily, I'm going to ask you once I'm done, because there's a lot to unpack there, to talk about the parking and how that works and not works. And this is not any random order, but he brought up some interesting points, and I actually was writing notes down as I was going. So there is a minimum parking requirement. There's no recommendation or suggestion in the plan that you don't have a minimum parking standard. It's the same parking standard that applies to uses throughout the city. There's no recommendation to eliminate that. The narrowness of the parcels is a factor that's going to eliminate certain developments from happening. So I think that, that might cut down on some of the concerns right off the bat, or hopefully it forces folks to work together to combine parcels to come up with a better development scheme than just trying to go one-offs on smaller pieces of property. One aspect, when you add more residential units, yes, we're recommending adding residential units because that will help subsidize and monetize the other parts of the development. There'll be shared parking, which is allowed throughout the city, which is a very common practice. The idea being the commercial folks come in during the day when the residents leave. So that's why you have shared parking, and you have a lower ratio than you're not trying to park every aspect of the commercial use versus every aspect of the residential use. I don't think anybody's proposing anything similar to Glover Avenue for this area. I mean, the scale of those projects to the scale of what we've shown in the plans and the schematics here it's night and day. It's not. I don't think it's a valid comparison. So there was a point brought up about the special permit and the peer review process, and then the application that's pending on 93 Winfield Street. Well, I think the application that people are up in arms about on 93 Winfield Street is a good reason why we're doing this plan. I mean, I think when you don't have a good plan, you get those kind of projects. And if they fit in with the current zoning, you're behind the 8 ball. What we're trying to do here is set the standard for how we want to see this area develop if and when it does redevelop. There's nothing in here mandating that it has to develop, but in the future, should it develop, this is the kind of vision we'd like to establish for this area. What's going to be required and different for projects going forward in this area will be, if they are by special permit, we have more stringent standards, and we put in place a peer review process with design standards. That's absent on a lot of other projects, and it is a big factor. Something else I think that's really interesting, which is within the plan, which Mr. Garcia brought up, which would be a valid concern that I would have, if there's more cars using that property, that they would spill over onto the residential streets. One of the plan recommendations in the traffic mobility and parking group has put in budget money to implement and study a residential parking permit program, and this would be a great spot to do that, with the idea being if you don't live there, you're not supposed to be parking there at certain hours. So that's something that can help alleviate that concern of, I don't have a place to park in front of my house. If I don't have parking in my own driveway, there's a parking pass program, so only folks who are supposed to be there are there. The last point which she brought up, which I thought was another good one, which we've already contemplated, is today the city put out the RFP for the zoning regulations rewrite, which is going to be a comprehensive rewrite of the entire zoning document. Within that, I've carved out some money to look at the East Norwalk TOD regulations. Specifically, I want them to look at the parking and look at the amenity bonus schedule. So whoever the consultant is at that juncture is going to, as a separate purchase order, is going to look at this and say, you know what you put together makes sense, or you need to revise it this way, or it doesn't work at all, and this is what I would recommend. So that's going to happen as a separate peer review on top of the work that Emily's firm is doing, what the zoning commission is doing, what you're doing, and then also what folks like Mr. Garcia are doing. So I think we're moving in on some of those recommendations already. They're good ones, we agree, and we'll implement those. Emily, could you briefly talk about the parking and the fit testing and why you think it's appropriate?
Yeah, we just on the fit testing itself, we use the existing parking requirement for the neighborhood business. We didn't change that at all. And as you noted, it is also not changed in the proposed zoning. So, you know, I think it's a fair comparison to use the fit studies. I do want to touch briefly on something that Mr. Garcia said that I think is really important. I know people have been concerned about this maximum number of units you can get per acre based on your residential density requirements. And what Mr. Garcia said is when you start putting in the FAR, the height restrictions, the sidewalk restriction, the amenity restriction, the parking restriction, he's absolutely right that you're never going to get to that, or it's going to be, I don't want to say never, you can have a parcel that's large enough potentially if you assembled enough to get to it, but it's going to be really difficult to get to those maximum units. You have enough other requirements in there that are kind of working sort of with and against each other, that type of volume is not going to be easy to get to. And that's one of the things that we found in our fit studies. So just be aware as you add more requirements during the zoning process. And I think Steve's point that whoever does the zoning for the entire city will also act as a peer review on this is an excellent idea, because as more ideas come forward during your process of approving the zoning and changing it to get to approval, you'll want to double check that you're not inadvertently adding something that will completely restrict development. And so that's one of the reasons we do these 3D fit studies, is to see what the unforeseen consequences of a new regulation might be.
Okay, with that, I will bring over, I'm going to bring Patricia in. I know she had a written question, so I'll bring her over. Did I lose her? All right, I lost her. So we'll go to Jay Christopher. If you could just say your name and address.
Hi, this is Diana Christopher. My phone died, so I'm using my husband's. And it's Diana Palladino, 1 Naples Street in Norwalk. And I just, want to thank you all. This has been very informative. And one of the things that I wanted to mention, I think there's so many things to get excited about in the plan, especially as, a young family with kids. I think overall the plan is wonderful. One of the things that I wanted to mention, and I know that it's been considered, and I know that traffic studies and impact of traffic are absolutely, being considered in this development. But one thing is, we're on the corner of Winfield. We're on Naples, but we're right on the corner of Winfield. And last year we had major traffic issues with my children's bus stop. And the traffic pattern was assessed in Norwalk Public Schools in conjunction with, I guess it was DPW, with a small input from the state as well, did in fact move the bus route because there were some valid concerns. And I'm just hopeful that, a true extensive look into what impact, anything on East Avenue will have on Winfield traffic as it approaches towards Triangle and Westport, Saugatuck. And also with that, with traffic and speeding on that street, it's very often used as a cut through. And so, certainly with any development, I would just be concerned that potentially it will, increase the traffic even more on Winfield where we are. So I just hope that, any additional, traffic studies, different timeframes, things of that nature during school, during rush hour, you know, perhaps different, you know, traffic patterns can be assessed. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so and I don't know the exact distance they're required to go, but any development that comes in that proposes a traffic study, there's a certain distance from the site that they need to look at in terms of the intersections and major roadways that are affected. I apologize, I don't know the standard distance, but that does get reviewed, and then our peer review consultant will also look at what they propose to make sure they've met all the standards, as well as any other impacts that they may have missed. I'm not sure if I addressed your issue specifically, but hopefully that is. And if I didn't, feel free to email me later on, and I'll get you hopefully a more coherent answer.
All right, Patricia's got her hand raised again. Hopefully I can bring her in this time. So she's using an older, and we'll try this. Are you there, Patricia?
Does she have that? There's a written question from her, Brian. I mean, I could read those off. They're at the,
Yeah,
I've got them up here if you want me just to, I'll try that, and then if this doesn't address it, we'll try to bring her back in.
Okay.
So it says Patricia Prince, it says, living on Fenwick Place adjacent to the mill pond, I'm concerned about the 87 units proposed for the Wells Fargo Cemetery Street. I'm concerned about the impact on the wetlands as well as traffic. There's already too much traffic, so much so that in the past several years, I think the roadway being reworked would have to take priority. What study has been conducted with regard to either concern? So there's, you know, as I mentioned during the initial presentation, there's no application or proposal in for that property. I mean, it's not a secret that they'd like to redevelop it. I mean, if you just look at that, there's a sea of asphalt with a tiny bank building on it, and it's crying out for a better use of land in that area. If you think about what we've proposed in terms of the requirements for how they redevelop the site, there'll probably be significantly less impervious surface there now. Stormwater will get handled better. There'll be, you know, a much better benefit to the environment in Mill Pond specifically. They'll have to do their own traffic study, so they're going to have to show that what they're proposing is not going to cause any detrimental problems or negative impacts on the existing traffic patterns. As I mentioned a couple of times, we will be conducting our own peer review of any study like that comes in to confirm that that's the case.
So Patricia, it says she's using an older version of Zoom, so it's not allowing her to speak.
All right, well, if she has any other questions, she can type them too if that's not working.
Yep. I think we lost Fran.
Oh. And anybody else that wants to type in a question, somebody's got a hand raised, Brian, too. I can unmute them.
Okay.
All right. Deb, can you, you're allowed, you should be okay now to talk if you're.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, hi, this is Dev from Desai from 11 Sycamore Street. So I'm pretty close to the TOD area. Just wanted to thank all of you and the presenter for sharing a really great plan. I really appreciated the discussion about human scale elements, plantings, and just I actually appreciated the lack of on-street parking. So I have to mention that as well. One thing that I would like to comment on is I'm a structural engineer and I've been in the building industry for a while. If we set the bar high, I've noticed that people do meet it in terms of sustainability. But if we don't set a bar at all, we typically get the minimum. I think now is a really good time to start talking about Norwalk and East Norwalk specifically, the path to net zero carbon. Because in order to meet kind of climate change targets globally, we have to adapt a fairly aggressive approach to this, trying to get to zero by 2050 and at a bare minimum, 50% by 2030. I know I mentioned this in my earlier question. My comment is I would recommend that if possible, we make this a requirement similarly to how we would make requirements for other aspects of the parcels. Because if we don't make it a requirement, we're going to end up with buildings that are not very energy efficient, maybe aren't made out of the best materials. They might be covered in vinyl siding. These are things we're going to have to fix later. So if we get ahead of that and say, you know, this is East Norwalk and we're pursuing very aggressive sustainability goals, we make sure we kind of get ahead of that and encourage the right thing. And I think if we set the bar pretty high, we're going to attract talent as opposed to not setting the bar at all and attracting kind of your business as usual developer and ending up with kind of business as usual results. So that is my comment, and thank you. I really appreciated the presentation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you for opening this up to residents.
Sure, and if you would like, Dev, if you want to email me offline, I'm happy those kind of things to get included. I think for the purposes of, and I'd have to go back and reread that section of the plan, Emily, chime in too, if you don't mind. If that needs to get tightened, or is that something we look at when the zoning regulations actually get discussed and really dug into?
I'm happy to look at what the plan says versus what the regulations say. I know we included some things, but if Deb decides to send you some more information, happy to look at that.
So our chairman has phone problems. She's trying to reconnect, but her phone keeps restarting, so she's having difficulty connecting at the moment. There's not any more, I don't see anybody else with their hand raised. I see a couple more written questions, and I don't know, Commission, and I don't know if, Mr. Mushak, I think you're the next officer, I believe, on the Commission, if you want to go that route.
Okay. So I just want to add one thing, Steve, to something you said earlier to a written commenter who had asked about the sidewalks on the East Avenue train bridge. And I don't think your answer was clear enough to that person. I apologize to you for saying that, but there are sidewalks on both sides of the bridge included in the widening plan. They're not extremely wide by any means, but they're going to be on both sides of the underpass. So that just wanted to make that clear. That person may not still be listening, but I don't think you just said that'll happen when they do the bridge. All right, so we have nobody else on the raising their hand or written comments. Is that correct?
Deb re-raised her hand if you want to take her again, or not sure.
The only question is how many times do we want to get different bites at the apple? Because if everybody, how do you want to end it, I guess would be the... Well,
I did see Patricia Prince, her image, her talking came up briefly. Did you see that, Brian? And
yeah, so she's on an old version of Zoom.
Okay.
So her audio is not functioning, and I also if I were to try to remove her, I'd kick her out of the meeting and it wouldn't let her rejoin. So I kind of just...
I still see her name, and I thought maybe she was waiting for...
I just tried to unmute her. Let me see if...
Hi, no, I'm back.
Oh,
okay.
Good.
Sorry about that. It was funny. I was in the middle of teaching, so I had to, hold on, let me just stop this. But I was on more than one computer. Anyway, I just my son had, sent me a text and I just wanted to make sure you understood. So it was great tonight. I saw a number of my neighbors, this has done one thing, which has brought really, I think, a great neighborhood community together. So as you probably know, we are on Fenwick Place and then Branford and so on. And 4 years ago, I was advised to become involved in the the transit-oriented development talks, and I didn't think it was necessary at the time. I guess I had no idea. So I saw some interesting ideas that seemed great, but I mean, obviously this is, and especially once you come by that cemetery, it really is the village of East Norwalk, you know, the historic, you know, between the cemetery. I know somebody actually mentioned over by Liberty Square, the, you know, the Native American, the fort and everything. Norwalk has a lot of history. So my concerns were always traffic. We've had a lot of problems with traffic, especially recently, obviously, with people coming from all over. And then obviously, my son mentioned something about impervious. You must have said that. I couldn't hear you because I was trying to switch devices, meaning in terms of instead of a bank parking lot, you know, perhaps housing would, you know, which would be fantastic. So, I mean, I was concerned about things like buffer zones between anything built there and, you know, obviously the mill pond, you know, being my number one concern. And in terms of traffic, and I guess, you know, people were texting me. So I thought perhaps I couldn't listen at that time to understand. I thought Lou brought up some great points as well. So he definitely did his homework, but I was curious as to what, obviously yeah, I understand East Avenue, but what sort of studies have been conducted? I think what I was told in the interim while I was away was that they would be studies done by, I suppose, us, or I guess that meant the city. They weren't clear as to what they were referring to. So I was just curious as to, you know what I mean, the thought, and I do understand, everybody's been telling me this as well, that there are no definitive plans for that area. But, you know, I was curious, you know what I mean, as to what thoughts had gone behind this and what studies really from, you know, the train bridge forward. It would seem in some respects it would seem to be turning it less into a village and more into a, I don't know, perhaps Sono would be a good, you know, way. I saw the, you know, the 3-story buildings and everything. And believe me, my impression changed. So I was just curious as to the studies. That's it. I'll cut it short. And I thank you for listening. This was great. And like I said, it was great to see so many people involved. So that was awesome too, because I'm not that person until it turns into my mill pond. But and that was it. So thank you.
Steve, you want to take over answering that concern?
Yeah, I was hoping she was still on because I wanted to get a clarification. I wasn't quite sure which area she was referring to, if that was south of Mill Pond or north of Mill Pond. I wasn't sure what study she was referring to.
I'm right on the mill pond. I am the house on the mill pond, the first house right after the bank. So it's in my backyard. So Fenwick Place. So really everything from, I guess, where you would consider the cemetery, you know, where there are like Raspados and, you know, the little shops, you know, where the little traffic circle. And then when the cemetery begins, that, you know what I mean, from that point beyond really has always been the historic village of East Norwalk. You know, it says it on the cemetery and everything. So I was wondering, just in terms of traffic, because it no longer seems so much like a village anymore, especially in summer, right? But and we are on the end of a dead end street. In case you don't know, Fenwick Place backs up to the mill pond. So there's only one way out and there's that turn that comes around. It makes things really, you know, difficult. And so I was just curious as to, in addition to the environmental impact, you know, what we were thinking. And like I said, somebody texted me about traffic studies, but I didn't really, you know, get any clarification. So that would be it. Just what your thoughts were on that and if any studies had been done.
Now, just so I'm clear, when you say beyond, are you saying towards the water or towards
Toward
95?
the water? Yeah, well, you know what I
Oh.
mean? From probably, I don't want to use this as a marker, but let's say from the train bridge, you know, where the house was taken down, right? And it's become a parking lot there. From that point to the water. And, you know, I suppose a little bit east and a little bit west of that, but, you know, basically in the circle, you know, going, you know, all the way down. My father-in-law's at the end of Cove Avenue. So, you know, really everything that would span here to there.
Okay, so I'm going to pull up a map that hopefully can illustrate this a little better. If you can hopefully see my screen.
Yep, I can see it.
So do you see the cursor where I'm pointing?
Yes.
Okay, So that's kind of the general area you're talking about. So south of there, so southwards, I'm going south towards the water. We're not
Right.
proposing any changes in that
Right.
area.
Right.
So
But
from,
up,
so the rail
yeah.
stations are here.
Right. So from there beyond, there down to the water, I mean, I understand little things need, obviously, as, some ideas were great, but in terms of keeping it in a historic, so from where you have, really from where the railroad station is south, so not just, so yes, we've got the gridded area, and I know that that's where proposed changes are. But my whole point is the character, and as you mentioned so well, really in the beginning, I thought that those were, fantastic ways to describe really, believe me, a fantastic area. We're very, very lucky with all the culture and everything that, has been here before us, right? So it started to seem that we would be bringing a lot more traffic, potentially maybe you could reroute things, but, a lot more traffic and a lot more density. And I've heard the word density quite a bit tonight, you know what I'm saying? But bringing that into a historic area, and still managing to keep that charm. I think sometimes it's more than a little bit of a facade, right? You know what I mean? How something would look aesthetically in terms of how it really does affect people's, quality of life and, things like that. But anyway, so really in terms of traffic then, and then just the impact on, I suppose, everything, quality of life even that would come from too much dense development of this, even if it were multi-residential, you know what I'm saying, better use of land. So traffic and environment then would be my questions.
Okay, I think I can answer it, and if I don't, I
It's
apologize,
okay,
and you can hit me up again, that's fine. So from the train station down to where Mill Pond is, in this area I'm pointing around covering is the proposed rezoning, which is the proposed village district. So that stops at, the southern end of the cemetery. And I didn't mention this, I mentioned it at one of a previous presentation. We understand that intersection and the traffic around this Gregory Boulevard and that intersection it doesn't function well and needs to get looked at. So the plan does recommend considering different things. I know Commissioner Mushak had recommended we look at a roundabout. So all things are on the table for future considerations by the Department of Public Works. So that's one aspect of it. Anything to do with any redevelopment on any properties, that's, obviously the elephant in the room is the Wells Fargo piece. That's going to require a separate traffic study, and they're going to have to look at impacts not only on their site, but how that could affect all the, they have to model where traffic will go, how many trips will get generated per day, what's the existing conditions, and then the city is going to do their own analysis of what's submitted. The other part I think you mentioned was environmental. Right now, I think it's probably close to 100% impervious surface out there. That I think will get greatly improved by any redevelopment scenario that comes forward. So I hope that answers your question. There's one written one. Lou Garcia had a quick question that had to do with the parking standards. So the parking standards that are in effect now are, as Emily mentioned, are what's being proposed. So I think the multifamily standard for the city is 1.3, not 2. 2 is for 1 and 2 families. So I think that answers that question. Is there anybody else with a hand raised, Brian?
Yeah, one, O'Hara, if you just want to state your name and address when I bring you over.
Can you hear us?
Yep.
Okay. We live on Fitch Street. We've seen a lot of changes throughout the years there.
Can you state your name, please, for us?
Go ahead.
Yeah, my name's Jim O'Hara.
Thank you.
We had a business down the end of Fitch Street for between my father and I, days shy of 63 years, so I'm pretty familiar with the history down there. Now, my question is, with all this development, happy talk and all that, is the bottom of Fitch Street by East Avenue is flooded for years and years and years and years. And, basically, at one point, they had a strip of asphalt going across East Avenue to prevent the water coming into Fitch Street, and the flooding seemed to have gone away, but it started flooding underneath the MTA bridge there. And that couldn't happen. So the bottom line is, have they got any plan to get rid of the flooding there? Now, if you go in front of St. Thomas Church, when they eliminated the monument at the end of Fitch Street and put that light there, they cut in a section so the hearses and whatnot, limousines could pull up in front of St. Thomas Church. But what they didn't do is they didn't tie the storm drain back over to the curb. So the storm drain is about 6 or 8 foot out in the middle of East Avenue, virtually useless unless water runs uphill. And on Fitch Street, the storm drains, you can go out there, if it hasn't rained for 3 months, the storm drain the pipe is half full of water, which tells me the water doesn't go uphill. And they've done absolutely nothing in 30 years or so.
Well,
So that's my question.
well, that, and is the MTA involved in this with the overhead bridge there?
Of course they are.
With your development plan? Because the
Yeah, so I can answer part of that. So, and I'll get a more firm answer for everybody next Monday. Vanessa Valadrez, who is, one of the principals in the Department of Public Works, was a part of this group. She's not on the call tonight. She can address that drainage question specifically and the impacts with the bridge, because I know that came up during, one of the early sessions with the committee about, if you lower the bridge, is the water going to pool there? And I know that's been addressed as part of their work. I don't have a specific answer to that. I can get that for the commission for the 24th, easy enough. And the second part, I just blanked out. Can somebody remind me what you just asked?
It was about the flooding, remember?
And then the
Yeah, about
MTA,
flooding, but
the
an
MTA
MTA, yes,
involvement.
correct. Yeah, so the replacement of the bridge is, it's a Connecticut DOT project, so Metro North is involved with that as well, so they're well aware of that aspect of it. And, just as I mentioned at the beginning, this study was funded through a grant from the state of Connecticut, so they're well aware of what we're doing. We've had meetings and conversations with them all along through the process.
So with that, if anyone else wants to speak, if you want to use the raise your hand feature, or the if you're on a telephone, you can dial *9 and it will raise your hand. I see Jim has raised his hand again. I'll leave that up to either Steve or Fran if they'd like to take additional questions from people who've already spoken.
Fran, I had one. There was a couple of written things about the process and myself and Emily responding to questions. I mean, this is a little different process. I mean, it's.
No, Steve, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything out of the ordinary. It's a public hearing. It's up to the commission's discretion whether they want to just take comment and respond. But I think, given the volume of people, I think it's better for us to address questions and give our opinion and state our answers for the reasons we recommended things and not recommended things. Unless anybody has an issue with that, I think it's been a healthier discussion that way.
No, Steve, keep going the way we've been going. And I apologize to everybody that my phone just kept on rebooting. I don't know why. So go ahead, Steve. Answer
There's
whatever.
one hand raised. There might be some written that we haven't got to.
Yeah, there is the question from Cheryl that's written in. Cheryl, Carol, and it looks like those are the two remaining. And then the quick one for Megan McNeil, who just asked how many people. There's currently 29 people attending. There were up to, I think, 40 earlier. And then there's the commissioners that you see.
All right, so I'll do these two written, and then we could go back to the one person with the hand raised. This is from Cheryl Ward. Given that East Norwalk has become a cut through for Westport and Sono, if you improve and grow the area for more businesses, you further encourage the traffic, which has an even further negative impact for those of us that live close to East Avenue. How do you plan to curb this? What's the solve? There were some recommendations within the plan, and I don't have those on a slide to show you, on ways to slow down cut through traffic, because that was brought up as a big concern. I think more so from the Westport side I heard than Sono, but I did hear Sono as well. So I think that some of those could get done. There was also some recommendations for additional enforcement in terms of that. You know, I don't know how we solve the Waze phenomenon, because if, you know, Waze directs people to get off and go through there, you know, I do that myself when I commute, you know, guilty as charged. I don't know how we quite solve that. Obviously, if, you know, we're not saying if you add more people and you add businesses that it won't add more cars. It obviously will. We think that, you know, the road improvements will mitigate that, and we understand that, you know, those road improvements aren't going to happen tomorrow. But keep in mind that, you know, while there'll be some projects that get approved in a shorter time frame once the you know, the regulations are adopted, it doesn't mean you're going to see the whole stretch of East Avenue from the cemetery up to 95 redevelop. It just, nothing seems to happen that way. That there's so much fragmented ownership, and the small parcels are going to make that a slow, long-term process, which is why this is a 10-year plan and a 10-year look versus like, let's get this done tomorrow. Next question.
Can I add something to that, Steve? Hello?
It's your meeting.
Well, it's Fran's. Fran, can I speak?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say that that person's question about the businesses is very good. And, you know, we're speaking tonight because the applicant is the city. You know, there's not a developer who's coming before us with a lawyer who normally would answer the question. So in this case, the plan is coming from the city. That's why Steve is speaking, staff is speaking, and you know, even I just wanted to add a point about the businesses. The goal is to not have destination businesses like you would see on Connecticut Avenue. The big box stores, the larger footprint stores are called destination businesses. They became a destination for people from out of town. Local businesses, on the other hand, neighborhood businesses, which would be more like one of my favorite restaurants, and I do go from Sono over to East Norwalk, full disclosure, to Partners Cafe, and it's not easy to find a parking spot. But you know, those basically serve more local businesses, and you have your coffee shops and dry cleaners and barber shops. Those aren't destination businesses where people will come from other neighborhoods or other parts of the city or from other towns to drive in to see those. They have their own local businesses that serve them. I just want to make that, that's a good point, but to make that distinction.
I think that's helpful. Thank you. There's one more. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it or not, but I'll read it out. And it was from a Carol Merritt. It says, great question, Scott. Tax increases with question marks. 06855 are the ones who will suffer and have to pay higher taxes. When will the information be available on the tax studies? So there's not a specific tax study that's under consideration. I mean, yeah, I don't know how to answer it any more than that. Do you want to allow that one speaker, Brian, and then we'll make a decision, I guess?
Yep, I'll bring Jim back over. Jim, if you're there, if you can unmute yourself, I'm not sure if I'm able to, if you'd like to speak. Just have to hover over your name and it should give you the option.
Okay, we're unmuted.
There you go. We can hear you.
Okay. Oh, no, I think we're good. You answered the question. We're going to stay tuned on all of this. We're good.
Okay, great.
Okay. Nope, there's nobody else, Madam Chairman.
Okay, there's no more comments to read, and there's nobody else with their hands raised?
Correct.
Is that a question oh, there is one at the bottom, Brian. I just saw from Elisa.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. It's a long one. So it says, I would like to ask how the committee thinks the road improvements would make a difference on the beach side of the railroad bridge traffic. There are only 3 ways to get out of East Norwalk, and there is really not much option for suddenly making multiple additional outlets. The city needs to understand that traffic in East Norwalk from the beach side to the highway on East Avenue is a disaster during rush hour. So much so that East Norwalk residents often drive through South Norwalk into Darien to get on the highway, as it takes the same length of time. Yeah, I mean, I can only tell you that we heard this, and I've observed it multiple times myself. We understand East Avenue has bottlenecks. A lot of that has to do with the configuration of the roads and the light system. When the improvements are made, it will enhance that flow. 95 on-ramp and on-ramp also have to get addressed too. We're not blind to that point. We do recognize that.
Can I add something?
Go ahead.
The state has a plan that is on hold, but it was for reversing the direction on at exit 16, which sounds strange, but it works in Europe and in other places in America, and to basically almost create continuous flow traffic and eliminate the left turn lanes, the left turns across opposing traffic. And so they would reverse lanes on both sides, and there would be a constant flow on and off the highway. It's sort of almost works like a roundabout, but it seemed to work in all the simulations, and it would alleviate the bottleneck on East Avenue in both directions, as well as the bottleneck on the stretches down onto the highways, creating hazards. I've actually seen the traffic all the way onto 95 north and south on the ramps waiting to go to those lights. So there were some people in the community who were opposed right off the bat to that. I'm not sure why, if it was going to increase flow, but in any case, the state was looking at it. Our DPW was looking at it. I don't know what the status is now, but it was a very interesting idea to alleviate that bottleneck at exit 16.
Okay. Steve, I had a question. Now I had a question on the developments whenever they come. Is there any control over what the design is? And I'm asking that because if you look around town, and I don't know, the architects, they're all the same, or there's a couple of architects being used, but everything looks the same, right? With a couple of few different things. So is there any input into that?
Yes, so the 3 areas, there are actually 4 areas in the city that actually have design standards. South Norwalk, West Ave, Wall Street, and what's proposed here. So this will technically, I guess, be the 3rd. The South Norwalk has design standards that are pretty well developed. Some of the newer projects that are under consideration and being built now fall under that category. So what we have established is they submit the plans for design review. They have to meet those standards, and then we have our outside peer review architect that works with them to enhance and refine the process. And it's worked really well on a couple of projects that have been approved, and I'd have to take you through the designs from submittal to approval to show you the differences and the nuances. This area has a completely different set of design guidelines, much more targeted, and there was a big theme we heard about this wants to be like it has like a maritime feel to it. So the standards and the images that Emily showed are the kinds of elements and design standards that are what's proposed for this area. I think, if I'm not wrong, Appendix E of the draft plan is the actual proposed design guidelines for this area. So they're pretty comprehensive, and they talk about all things from architecture, building massing, scale, setting back the building, landscape treatments, facade treatments, sidewalk treatments, lighting, signage, so it's pretty comprehensive. And I think it's probably more comprehensive than any of the other design guidelines that we have in the city. So I'm kind of hoping that this is a good template we can use in some other areas. So maybe for the next meeting on the 24th, everybody, if you get a chance, go through that section in a little more detail and see what you think about that.
Okay, thanks. Is there, well, what do you want us to close the hearing for now? There's nobody else there that wants to speak or has sent in messages? You wanted to discuss some scheduling issues?
Yeah, I'd say you could, if there's nobody else active, you could close the hearing for tonight and then reopen it on the 24th.
Okay, so barring and nobody else is there waiting, we're gonna close the public hearing. We'll resume again on, now Monday, are we going through the public hearing first or the regular business first?
That's one of the things I wanted to talk about, because there's 3 items on that agenda. Brian, do you have that to pull up, or I could probably find it too? That might be it. I kind of remember what they are top of my head, but it'd be good to figure out what we want to do for a game plan, and how much time you want to budget for this. There are 2 824 referrals from the Department of Public Works to address. So I'm thinking it would be better to do those at the outset, so that way they don't have to sit there for an hour. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
They don't have to sit there for a couple of hours or an hour and a half and listen to, more comments about the TOD plan. We could reverse the order and take item B and C before we do the public hearing. And then I don't think those will take too long. And then the big item is what we want to do with the Glover Avenue Merit 7 proposal. I discussed this with the chairman the other day about it'd be a good idea if there was a joint public hearing between the Planning Commission and the Zoning Commission, so you're all hearing the same items together, so you're getting the most up-to-date information. The applicant has put out some additional materials and has some further responses from public comments that came in and questions from the Zoning Commission. So the question is, do you want to try to do that on that night as well, or do you want to try to squeeze in another meeting to address that separately? That's the big question.
No, I don't want to, I had proposed a joint meeting, but it's not going to happen Monday. My thoughts are, and everybody else can chime in, I don't want people to be waiting 2 hours for us to get done for the continuation of public hearing. I would prefer that at 6:30, we restart the public hearing and allow, I don't know, an hour and a half, depending on what the amount of people is there. And then we go into our regular meeting. And as far as the North 7, I had sent an email to everybody. I didn't hear back from anybody on the thoughts of having a separate meeting for that topic, except for Tammy. Tammy sent in a response with an affirmative about having a separate meeting. So I would prefer separate meeting on North 7 and joined with the Zoning Commission. It's fine. That's what I had said a while back. I propose that the Monday, we go through the public hearing first, and then we go on to the regular agenda, because all these items, we may think it might take a minute, but it's probably going to take longer. So I'm open to everybody's thoughts over there.
I agree with you, Fran.
Okay. Anybody else?
I agree.
Okay.
I agree. I'm fine with it. Thank you.
Okay.
Less work for us. So
I have a question to Steve. Are there any time constraints on the Merit Station in terms of any other referrals or the schedule of the Zoning Commission? If we do a joint hearing, then that's, or a joint meeting, I guess that would alleviate that. But are there any other time constraints you're aware of?
no, we've already gotten extensions as a belts and suspenders measure from the applicant. The governor, as because of the pandemic, put out all these executive orders, and one of them was extending time periods on land use applications. So we're covered twice. So yeah, and we've talked to the applicant at length, and they understand that this is a large undertaking and a big consideration for the city, and that we want to take our time and then make sure we ask all the right questions and make the correct decisions as we go through. So there is, to say specifically to your question, there's no time consideration right now.
Well, I think it's a courtesy to them actually that to just not make them wait for the public hearing as well, to put that into another meeting. So it's another meeting for us, but we don't know how many people may show up and speak on the TOD plan on next Monday. So I think that's better to take that out. I agree with Fran.
So Steve,
so that's just,
go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that means, we just have to set a separate meeting date if you want to do that. I don't have an exact date on the joint public hearing. I may know a little more tomorrow, but I'm thinking it's going to be sometime in mid-September.
So we need a separate date for the planning commission to get together and have specifically the one item on the agenda is going to be the North 7. And then we have the joint public hearing with zoning sometime September or whatever, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So come up with some dates. This item will come off this agenda. And then, propose some dates, everybody, whatever your availability is or however the availability looks for everybody. And then, so Monday we'll have, and I don't know if you got to revise the agenda here. We'll start with the public hearing at 6:30, and then we'll go on to our regular business. Correct?
Yep. Yeah, we'll take off items D through F. I'll contact the applicant tomorrow and get his schedule, and then I'll send out an email to you guys with to get your schedules, and we'll try to find a match.
Okay, and what's at the bottom of your, you got 2 more items, I think, on the agenda there, for what I could
Oh
see?
yeah, I'll bring that back up.
I think one was the calendar for 2020, because I think we pretty much settled on that, but, and then there's just some, ongoing update kind of things.
Well, the budget schedule, well, what's the status of, what day are we moving the planning commission meeting to? We said what?
I thought we said the second Wednesday.
Okay, I remembered Wednesday, I remember what, so the second Wednesday, which did not coincide with zoning or whatever, right? So starting in January, we're gonna be having our meetings on the second Wednesday of the month. Right?
Yeah, and we'll be working on the schedules for all the boards probably in another month or so, so we'll make sure we include that.
Okay, you had sent us a piece of paper with hard dates on there already, so everybody could look at it. And I think we, I didn't see any comments or anything.
I think there, I don't, there, oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Well, I've one question about next Monday's hearing. If we got the presentation tonight, next Monday, if there are members of the public, and I'm sorry, there's fireworks going off outside my house if you hear banging. Anyway, that's distracting, but I would love to see the presentation for people who are going to be tuning in next Monday who were not on tonight, which is going to be more people. Is there any way to show a recording of the presentation tonight that we would just have to sit through again, but the public would benefit from? Or if we publish an agenda, can we have a note on the agenda that says people can view it online with a link? It's because people could watch the whole presentation on their own if they're a way of spreading information. That's all. It's a way of communicating.
So however you guys want to do it, but this meeting is being recorded and will get posted on the city website, and then it's also streamed live on YouTube right now, so you can always go to YouTube and rewatch it. But those are just 2 ways to rewatch tonight's.
So whatever your announcement's going to be, Brian, agenda, whatever, you should call that out, that people can look at the presentation, right,
Yep.
with the link on YouTube, so whoever's gonna be tuning in on Monday, they will have seen the charts. Since they're available, they will not be shown again Monday night, but they're available for people to view them before the meeting.
Okay.
And I actually would like to see if there was a way to link that and just condense the presentation in a, I don't know how you do it, but you know, the younger people would figure it out, is take that recording and make a separate YouTube link out of it, and then advertise that or put that on the city website, because what we've been sharing with everyone, I think, is just basically a printed version of the plan, but not that verbal presentation, which I think really is helpful between Steve and Emily of explaining the plan.
So
Is that
Brian, can you put the link in so it, they click on it and it opens up?
Yeah, so I'll add that to the agenda, and then I will figure out, I'll talk with Steve about where to put it best on the website for people.
Yep, so that when they click on it, it will launch. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we can, we'll call it out in big bold type, so it's clear that if they want to look at that. We did, when we publicized before, we pointed people to the prior presentations. We did back-to-back presentations in June, so we sent out the link to that, so if people wanted to watch that. And it's a fairly similar presentation to what you saw tonight. Emily just enhanced a few things with the parking and the amenities, but in essence, it's the same material.
Yeah, but I want you to use specific words saying, this is what was shown. If you're gonna call into the Monday's public hearing, view this, because so I want you to make it clear to people that they can look at what was shown here tonight in preparation for their attendance to Monday's meeting. Whatever words you want to use.
We'll do that.
Make it simple.
Yep, we can do that easy enough.
And there's some links on to all the plans. You could also put it there on the website in case somebody's looking for information there. Great.
Yeah, we'll put that all in one big bulleted box or something.
Okay. What else is on the agenda? It's not up, so anything else?
Just the industrial zone study update and then capital budget schedule.
Steve, what do you want to say about the industrial zone update?
Well, I just got an email today from what's that?
Sorry, I was gonna say ask for next week, 'cause I don't know, I didn't look at tonight's.
Yeah, it's not really on tonight's, but I can
On
update you.
tonight? Whatever you want to do.
Can
It's
you
fine.
tell us when it's gonna start?
Yeah, so the consultants put together, like, they're working on a initial meeting presentation material, which they just sent me today, but I was inundated with emails today, so I didn't get a chance to look at it, but they're gonna set up a meeting with the committee in probably about another week or two, and that'll, be like the official kickoff of that study.
And we did receive a bunch of emails that came in from residents, right? We all received that in email about 3 o'clock or so this afternoon. I don't know if everybody got a chance to read those, but 6 or 7 of them Steve sent all in one email.
Yep, and those are gonna be part of the record as well.
Right, I'm just telling the commission in case they didn't get a chance to read them, you may want to read them. Okay, anything else?
No, for tonight, that was the only agenda item, was just the public hearing. And your approval of minutes for June 16th and July 21st.
For Monday or for tonight?
That's for tonight.
I wasn't prepared for that, sorry. That wasn't on my agenda for me. Is it on there? I don't remember.
Yeah, that's right. We can push it off.
Push it off.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, any other comment or comments of director, anything else, Steve?
Nope.
All right, commissioners, anything you want to bring up?
No,
Okay. Apologies again if I had to, that I was out for about 20 minutes. And Tammy, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, you're gonna make your motion?
Oh, yes. Could I just make a comment, please?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to agree with the gentleman who was talking about that development on the old, I believe, Bank of America site on Winfield Street. And I think that developer is totally cramming too many buildings on that site. And the POCD talks about open space. I don't know where the people that live there are supposed to stand outside other than in their driveway. So that's just my comment. Thank you.
if I may add something, Fran, I'd like Steve maybe to give us an indication of, he said with 93 Winfield Street, that in fact, if it's already in the plan, in other words, under current regulations, we're behind the 8 ball. What does that mean, Steve? Because this property developer is gaming the system, it's totally unacceptable, it's irresponsible, it's almost an immoral move, an unethical move on his part. So why are we behind the 8 ball on this?
Well, the law is pretty clear that if you submit an application before an agency adopts new regulations, you're bound by the regulations in effect at the time you submit it. Even if everybody thinks what you're proposing is great, they're not, they don't have to adhere to what you're thinking about. They're adhere to the law on the books at the time. Just to give you a 30-second update on that, so they submitted a whole package that was reviewed by staff. We've also received comments from Mr. Garcia and some other residents in the area, and we've sent all that back to the applicant. Said this, there's some significant issues that where we feel this doesn't comply. That was probably 2 weeks ago. We haven't received any comments back from the applicant yet. We're imagining that they're back at the drawing board to some extent. So they haven't been in front of the zoning commission yet. Nothing is scheduled at this time. So, I don't anticipate that happening until the end of September or early October at the earliest, because whatever they have to submit, we have to start a brand new review on again.
And I want to add in that I had a conversation with Steve because the renderings that they provided, which are online, has the topography has the rest of the neighborhood all flattened out and just the proposed construction building up. So to me, it looks like, it's a rural area with this construction going on, when in fact, there's housing left, right, and in between. So it's a disingenuous rendering, as far as I'm concerned, does not show the real, what the situation is. And I've talked to Steve about it as far as there's not much that can be controlled as far as what the applicant chooses to show. But when it's so bad that it doesn't show anywhere near what the actual situation is, it's just bad. So I had that discussion with Steve, but there isn't much that can be done as to what a applicant decides to submit. Okay.
And if they submit something that's not well done or well put together, then it hurts him. It doesn't benefit anybody. I'm not sure why they choose to do that, but my guess is it's usually a monetary decision.
Well,
to be clear to everyone, this commission doesn't have purview over that project. So I think that's why everyone is feeling free to talk about it ahead of time. It's the zoning commission approval. Is that correct? I just want to get that clarity from you, Steve.
yeah,
Because normally we would not be talking about an application. Some might say we shouldn't be talking about an application that is before another commission.
Steve,
For the most part, I agree, but in light of that, it's part of the study area we're looking at. I mean, that context to it is, you're correct though. If this was something that was coming in front of the planning commission, we would not be having this conversation.
just wanted to get that clear for the public, if anybody's still watching, that's not coming before us. So the concerns are valid for sure. I'm not diminishing those in any way, but we're not predetermining a decision on this based on the fact that it's not coming before us. So.
No, that is correct. The only reason why I originally brought it up is because we are having this East Norwalk TOD discussion. Otherwise, for all concerned, if there was anything, we would not be talking about any application that would be coming in front of us, nor commenting on zoning commission. I thought I saw this as a unique, as we're in the middle of the TOD, and one of our members, Brian, has been on that task force, and that's why I brought it to the attention. Okay.
I also just, Fran, I agree with you. And we're a very opinionated group, and there's absolutely every right to share those opinions. And the point that's so valid really is that the TOD plan would have prevented this project from happening. And so I think we can, summarize that at the end. That's kind of why it was on everyone's mind, besides the fact of the impact of the project itself.
That's correct. And thank you, Mike, for making it clear for everybody. Thank you. Is there anything else from anybody? All right, Tammy, it's your turn.
I have a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you
Thank
Monday.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.